Hello and welcome to episode 126 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking CDL Champs 2024. The final event of the 2024 Call of Duty League season is nearly here, and we're going to preview the entire thing, talk about each of the 8 teams competing at this weekend's event. And we'll talk about some other stuff as well. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
I'm doing all right. I had a little bit of a storm here just 30 minutes ago when we tried to do this, but hopefully it'll subside. And if I lose power or anything, apologize in advance. But other than that, yeah, this is I was saying at the end of the last episode, this is one of my favorite shows of the year. So looking forward to jumping right in.
Yeah, so this is obviously it's champs. It's the biggest event of the year, the most important event of the year. This is kind of an event every single year where you can kind of make or break a season. You know, you could dominate a year or dominate an entire season, but if you don't win champs, it's going to be lackluster. And regardless of how you did for the first 5-6 months of a season, if you win champs, then everything is fine. It all worked out in the end. And we're definitely going to have that this year. Of course, we talked about it over the past few weeks, but 4 different teams won the 4 majors this season. The top 4 teams that we've been talking about this entire time, Atlanta FaZe, the New York Subliners, Toronto Ultra, and Optic Texas, those 4 teams have been kind of the talk of this podcast and just of the COD community in general, as the 4, what we believe to be the legitimate championship contenders. And that has worked out throughout this entire season. But, 4 other teams also have chances to win champs and really cement their legacies or create legacies in a lot of different players' points of view. So obviously, we will talk about champs. I think it's best that we just get some of the smaller topics out of the way first, and then we can completely focus our attention on CDL champs. The first thing just happened like 45 minutes ago. CDL Scrim Intel, they clipped a moment from Formal stream where he addressed a question. He was asked if he was going to play Black Ops 6, and he said that he was going to play Black Ops 6 and he was going to play BO6 professionally. So that would seem to be an indication that he's coming back to COD, at least maybe just attempting it in the preseason, which we've seen a lot of former players do. Of course, a former world champion, one of the most talented Call of Duty players, one of the most talented Halo players, potentially the best FPS player of all time, considering his versatility. Your thoughts on Formal potentially making a comeback to Call of Duty in late 2024?
I mean, it's huge if it actually comes to fruition. I feel like, most long time Call of Duty fans, or especially those who have been um, around long enough to know some of the trends really before the CDL started, when it was still kind of like COD Esports was in that stage. Like, there were some contracts going around, but not everybody was contracted to the teams, and it was kind of like free agency, roster mania, just rapid fire moves happening, people sketching and stuff like that. But back in those, I mean, even not necessarily super long ago, but I mean, like I'm most likely thinking about like World War II era, where it went from jetpacks back to boots on the ground. You saw a lot of long time uh, former COD pros like tweeting, "I'm gonna come back for World War II," or COD's back on boots on the ground, "I'm gonna come back too." And you saw them like saying that stuff, and then for certain people, it never really materialized into anything. Um, Formal is obviously much different than some of these other people who are saying that, though. Obviously, as you mentioned, one of the most successful FPS players in esports history. So if he sets his mind to it and wants to compete in Black Ops 6, then I think there's a strong likelihood he will do that. The bigger question is the implications behind this for Optic. And we've seen, in the past, obviously, when the dynasty broke up and he went to Luminosity, Octane came over to Optic. Um, we've seen Formal compete not on Optic in the past, but if it felt like when he obviously I'm not super in tune with the Halo scene or whatever, but it felt like when he stepped down from the COD team or stopped competing in COD and transitioned back to competing in Halo again, he was like loaned out to like the Sentinels or Phase team, something like that. The team with like Frosty and those guys, I think, before getting on Optic's official Halo team. Something like that could happen here where he has to like kind of like show what he's capable of again and make his way back onto Optic, or he could just, Hex could be like, yeah, Formal's on this team. We just got to figure out the rest around him. Um, so lots of implications, and we've already talked about, Optics make or break at Champs really in terms of the future of this roster. If they bomb out at Champs, it's probably most likely we won't see this roster again. But if they have a decent showing at Champs, considering they uh, won a championship this year, there is the potential they stick together. Now, regardless of how they play at Champs, there is the potential that if Formal wants, a spot, he could realistically be given the opportunity to play on Optic's main team. It's going to be interesting, and it definitely throws a wrench in things for the Optic camp. And like I was really, before I was kind of like in this headspace of, yeah, how they play at Champs is going to dictate whether or not this team makes changes. Now, regardless of what they do at Champs, there is the potential they make. I mean, they could win Champs and technically make a move if Formal says he wants to come back, right? That would be highly unlikely in my eyes, but it's a realistic scenario just based on the fact of who Formal is and what he's done for Optic and the scene. It's definitely interesting and something we're gonna have to keep our eyes on all off season now for sure.
I'm just skeptical of the viability of a return for Formal, and that's not just for him. I believe that of pretty much every single former COD pro, like you alluded to, with some of the old players saying, "Well, I'm going to try to make a comeback now that it's not jetpacks or whatever." When like World War II came about, no one really succeeded in that comeback effort. I can't remember someone that actually had like a ton of success. And Form was, of course, like I said, one of the best Call of Duty players of all time, one of the most talented Call of Duty players of all time. But at the same point, he's been out of the game for 3 years now. His last event was Champs 21. So that
Wow.
was nearly it'll be 3 years from next month that he played a competitive, like high level Call of Duty tournament. And I just don't think that someone 3 years out of the game can come back in and make an impact to the degree that a team like Optic would need him to have in order to be competitive in as competitive of a league as we have now. Like we've mentioned in the past, like the rosters are incredible. The top four rosters are pretty much all-star teams if you really think about it. And while I believe Formal would have, he has a better chance of having success than a lot of people do that are in challengers just grinding simply because he's super talented. Um, I just don't believe that that's something that he probably should do. I think but maybe you could probably say the same thing about his Halo career, right? Because he wasn't involved in Halo for a long time, and he came back and he had a ton of success immediately. I tend to think it's a little bit harder to do that the other way, to go from anything or go back into COD and try to have that kind of success. Um, I think a player like Frosty would also have trouble trying to come back. Of course, Frosty, I think, is a better Halo player than he is a COD player, even though he's very, very good at COD as well. But I just have a lot of skepticism about Formal coming back and trying to, especially if he came back into Optics roster, the pressure that comes with. And I mean, I would love it for the drama, just simply, that they're looking out for one of their boys, but um, like this seems like it would be a really big mistake on Optic's part if they just slotted Formal back in. But I guess we'll see what happens at Champs if and how serious Formal is about competing and whether he's willing to give up Halo to pursue that kind of thing. I just don't know because it wasn't the whole thing that he just hated playing COD and he enjoyed playing Halo. So I do not think that Black Ops 6 will completely reinvigorate the love of COD for formal. I would just take a guess on that. And then it comes down to really how much is he willing to put up with all the crap that Call of Duty players put up with or competitive players do. So I think it's interesting, but I'm definitely skeptical about whether that's a good idea. Um, let's talk about comeback player of the year because it actually kind of fits into what I mean, obviously, if Formal came back and he was super good next year, like we'd probably have a pretty similar conversation. But I want to get this right. I think it was Ethan at Ethan C. Glenn on YouTube. He commented on our last video and said, if you had to pick a CDL comeback player of the year, someone not in the league last year or who played poorly then bounced back, who would you pick? And of course, we did like our awards show last time. We talked about the MVP, Rookie of the Year, All Star, and Comeback Player of the Year is something that happens, I think, really only in the NFL. But it is an award where mostly it's a player who was injured the previous season, or I've remember like Alex Smith had like a really serious and gruesome injury. He came back, and he won Comeback Player of the Year. This past season, my boy Joe Flacco, he won Comeback Player of the Year after leading the Browns to the playoffs. Which is obviously the funniest thing in the world because he beat DeMar Hamlin, who technically died on the field the previous season as when he was on Monday Night Football. So, it's obviously more impressive to lead the Browns to the playoffs than to actually come back from death. But that's here nor there. But CDL Comeback Player of the Year, it's different because we don't have the rate of injuries, or the injuries are not as severe typically in esports or COD esports. So we don't really have players. I mean, we did have Illy, for example, who had his injury in 23, and then he didn't play pretty much the rest of the season. Or he got benched. He came back and then got benched or whatever. So he's kind of dealt with this thumb thing. And he came back last year and this year, so you could, I guess, say that. And obviously, there's Zuma, who retired because of an injury, but he obviously hasn't come back to this point. That kind of leaves us in a situation where it's a player who has not performed well or been benched or maybe has been gone from the CDL for a while. So some potential candidates would be someone like Diamond Khan, who obviously played this entire season with the Gorillas, but he really hadn't had a ton of CDL time since that first season with New York. I think he, here or there, he might have gotten a shot, but for the most part, he had been just kind of grinding his way through challengers. Fellow is also another one who he's actually probably a candidate most years because he hasn't been able to completely stick with a team year over year. But he was, on like Florida last year, and obviously Florida was really bad to end the season. And he got on Carolina this year and was able to get them close to a champ spot. Vickle, again, Florida was very bad last year. Vickle was the lone holdover from the Florida Mutineers to the Miami Heretics, and he helped them get to champs this season. And then someone that you mentioned before the show began, and someone who I didn't really think about, but the more I think about him, I think he would actually fit the bill, is Attach. Attach, obviously, 2 years ago was an all-star, despite not being on a top championship level team in Minnesota, even though they did win the major, I think the final major. But he was obviously the best player on that team. Last season did not go according to plan. He ended up being benched and I think brought back at the very end of the season. And I don't believe Minnesota made it to champs. So, a lot of things kind of went wrong for him personally, in terms of the game and as a team. And this year with Vegas, again, didn't make champs, unfortunately, because how things ended up. But he was, one of the best ARs. I think we even talked about him last week as a potential all-star because of his individual play. But I think, individually that he's a very good candidate. Who do you think is, obviously I laid out some of the other candidates. I don't know if you had any others, but like the idea of just like coming back and kind of redeeming yourself. Who jumps out to you as a potential comeback player of the year?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't even thinking about Illy until you had mentioned that, so I
Hmm.
think that's a good shout too. Obviously, if you stuck it out this year or stayed on Seattle or stayed in the league, he probably would be the leading candidate. I think after uh, hearing everything you just said and kind of thinking about it while you were talking, I think Diamond Khan does make the most sense. He's someone who just wasn't in the league and is now back in the league and on a team that made champs when so many people weren't expecting them to even finish in the top 8 to make champs. Um, I do think you can definitely make cases for all those other guys, especially like Fellow. Like even last year, Fellow wasn't really in the league. Gets a shot on Florida at the end of the year. Florida didn't do great. He didn't, necessarily do anything spectacular, but he didn't get a shot at the start of this year. Still grinds through challengers, gets another opportunity this year. So I think Fellow's a good shot. I think Vickel is too, just in the sense of like you said, he's the lone player from Florida they were able to keep in the transfer and merger to become Miami Heretics. And Heretics are obviously at champs, so that's kind of a bounce back season more than like a comeback player of the year. I guess it's kind of splitting hairs, but and then attach, like I think it's a solid argument from like a statistical standpoint, just because of like we were talking about last week with the All Star stuff he had. I think it was like the sixth or fifth best KD on the season overall. But really, it's kind of hard to give it to him because he was benched, yes, but it wasn't like super long term. I think it was only like a small portion of the season at the end there, and then like you said, he made his way back into the roster anyway. So I think I'm leaning Diamond Khan. That's a really cool storyline. The whole we've talked about LAG now and this situation with them coming into the season, all the drama around the roster and the coaching staff and everything like that, for them to even be in this position competing at champs now, many people wouldn't have thought they'd even be here. So uh, I like that storyline. I think Diamond Khan would be the recipient of my vote for the hypothetical comeback player of the year.
Yeah, I was just looking through some of the rosters to see if we're missing anyone. I guess Hook could be considered, but he kind of made a comeback on Optic last year, where I
Yeah.
think if this was last season, maybe he would have, maybe he would be considered, because I think really his stock had really never been lower. Like leg, he kind of was like, okay, individually he's doing pretty well, which was kind of a surprise to see after having kind of like a little bit of a run there where he was just kind of like spinning his wheels. But he kind of started to, obviously Optic were very good last year until obviously like the very end. So maybe he could be considered. I was actually thinking Brezzy, but then I'm like, he's actually never even played in the CDL before, so like you can't really come back from that. Unless you want to consider that he's a comeback from a CDL sub like several years ago, and he somehow got his shot this time around, and he was able to be on a champs roster. Even same thing with like the Heretics guys, like they hadn't been in the CDL and they were able like, but they were in the CWL. So I don't know how far you're going back. But yeah, I think, or and the last one would be Joe DeCeves, who was a rookie last year, and obviously was on leg, and they were awful, and he didn't really get to show like really how much he had to how much he had to give for leg, but he's been, even this year, he, I think at some point was benched on lat and he was
Yep.
brought back. So, that's a cool story. But yeah, I think someone like Diamond Khan or, Diamond Khan is like you said, a great story of like perseverance and belief from the lag side that they stuck with him this entire season and they picked him at the beginning of the season. Really cool to see him make it back after he had like a really good season with New York. I remember like
Yeah.
his rookie season, and it obviously really just hadn't been panning out the last few years. But I think Yeah, I think Diamond Khan is probably a good pick for comeback player of the year. And last thing before we talk about champs is the Boston Breach. They officially announced the release of Priesta, Beans, Pentagram, and Major Maniac this week, leaving the only player on their roster to be Snoopy. So that kind of shows where their priorities lie, most likely, in terms of at least the Esports World Cup. We'll see what happens past that, but that had been the rumor that Snoopy would be the lone like holdover for the Breach at the Esports World Cup, and then they would bring around, bring a few players in to play with him. Your general reaction to the Boston Breach's release of these four players? Obviously, Major Maniac, a late season pickup. Well, three of these guys were mid-season pickups. Priesta, of course, a world champion last year with the New York Subliners, came over in the preseason with Boston. But do you see this as a good move, or where are you on the Snoopy project now that it seems like they're building around him still?
I mean, I still feel like the move for Boston was to just clean house and start over, but obviously it seems like at worst, they're giving Snoopy one last chance with the Esports World Cup. Um, I guess technically my real thought process was like I think Boston should clean house for the CDL roster, depending on Snoopy's contract situation, have him like headline a challengers team if they're going to compete in challengers. But obviously that's getting a little more technical with it. Regardless, I think just after the season Boston had, they needed a fresh start, needed to um, you know, just move on from everything that happened this year. Saw some stuff on the timeline of people being confused about Ben Beans. I was thinking Ben Beans for some reason. About Beans being released and being confused, and I just feel like at the end of the day, I mean, even like you just said, Priest is a defending world champ. Like regardless of the way the players played individually or as a team this year, is just as a team they struggled, and you just gotta go your separate ways and try and find a fresh start. So we'll be interested to see Priesta for sure if he is able to get on another team. He has a pretty um, you know standout resume in terms of available free agents. Obviously, some competition there with Clayster as another known free agent so far, but we'll be interested to see him and Beans if they get a shot. Pentagram seemingly tweeted that he's retiring, so unfortunate situation for him. We've kind of just been someone we've talked about over the years now, where it's like he was a sub, hadn't really got a chance. He got his chance for literally like a month and a half or 2 months this year. Didn't really play well, didn't really work out, and was on a team that was on a historic losing streak. So. Um, Obviously didn't go the way he wanted it to, but wishing him the best if he is done competing in COD. And the Major Maniac, kind of like what I said when he was signed, like it was a risky move, given his position in Challengers, and like now not being able to compete at Esports World Cup or Challengers Champs or COD Champs because he decided to join a team that had a very long shot to make CDL champs. But was his individual performance enough to catch the attention of CDL GMs as somebody who they can potentially target in the off season? That's a question we're gonna have to wait and see if it's answered in the off season. But yeah, not surprised necessarily. Boston decided to move on from these guys. Um, we'll just have to see now. It's kind of crazy to talk about roster mania, but technically off season started for 4 teams when they didn't qualify for champs, so we're technically in roster mania now, even though champs is still yet to be played. But we love roster mania around here, so I can talk about that for days.
Yeah, I think I'm on board with what they're thinking about building around Snoopy. Obviously, I'm kind of a Snoopy truther at this point, and I believe that he does have something to give, and it just kind of depends on what you're willing to put around him or what you're able to put around him in terms of players. Obviously, from what we have seen and the moves that they've made, it definitely appears that the Breach coaching and the coaching staff and the management believe in him to the point that they're keeping him. Um, Whether that's the right move or wrong move, you'll probably have to see in 6 months to a year to really get the idea of how well they performed with him. But I get the idea, and I probably would do the same if I were in their shoes. It just this offseason is going to be really critical though, because I likened it to Hydra. After the Crim Six Paul X debacle at the end of 22, I think, and then the next year they came and they put really good players around him. They won 2 majors and a world championship the next year. I don't think that's necessarily in the cards for the Breach, but if they can make this team into a playoff or like a champs team, maybe top 6, striving for that 5th, 6th spot, I think that's a really good position for them, and that's probably what they should be shooting for. But obviously, that's far down the road. We'll see what they actually end up doing for the Esports World Cup roster in the next month or so. And then that brings us to champs. We are obviously we only have really 4 matches to talk about, that are actually set in stone. But it's we're going to talk about the teams more and what we think of them going into this event, just in general, because anything can happen at champs. Everybody starts on the same playing field. They're all in the winners bracket, no losers bracket that you start in for champs. Of course, 8 teams will compete at this event. The only tournament all year that features just 8 teams. We usually have all 12 teams at the majors and 4 teams starting the losers bracket. Here we have all 8 teams starting in the winners bracket. And let me quickly just give you the first round matchups in the winners bracket. So the number 1 seed Atlanta FaZe versus the 8 seed Miami Heretics. Then the New York Subliners versus the Seattle Surge. The Toronto Ultra versus the LA Thieves, and Optic Texas versus the Los Angeles Guerrillas. Man, that is a weird group of teams to talk about. I think it would be silly to talk about this event as anything but like there is a top 4 and then there's a bottom 4, and how things work out. Okay, there's a top 3. There is a team that we believe could be 4th, and then there is a bottom 4. Of course, what Optic Texas does at this event, or what version of Optic shows up at this event, will completely change how this tournament goes. If the Optic Texas from the first 3 quarters of the season shows up, then we have 4 championship level teams very capable of winning the championship. If Optic of the last month and a half shows up, we have 3 championship level teams, and the green wall will completely erupt with anger by Friday or Saturday night. Of course, that it's tough to even predict. It's tough to even talk about, because we've seen in the past where teams are completely abysmal online or in the the month or month and a half leading up to an event, and then they just go on a little bit of a run. They get a little bit of momentum and they find their groove. And that very well may happen with Optic. This is a team that has lost, I believe, like 7 or something, some ridiculous number of matches in a row. They've lost so many search and destroys. They've lost so many game 5s that, and not to just championship level teams, they're losing to teams that aren't even at this event. And that really makes me wonder whether this team has anything to give when it comes to champs. So they've lost 7 in a row. They've lost 6 of those have been in game 5. They were swept by the Toronto Ultra in their final online match of the season. Their last win was June 1st, a 3-0 win against the Miami Heretics. And before then they had lost 1 match in their last 15 or something ridiculous like that. They were very, very strong to that point. So this has been a complete shock as to why they have completely fell apart now. But I think we have to talk about Optic first, simply because
Yeah.
they're the biggest wild card and question mark going in. What Optic do you think shows up when it comes to champs this weekend?
I don't even necessarily know if I have a good answer to that. The way I'm looking at it is that no matter what version of Optic shows up, they arguably have the toughest first round matchup here of, regardless of what you think of the rankings and whatnot, it's pretty clear, like you said, there's a top four and a bottom four. You can say like a top three and one super mega wild card and then a bottom four. But no matter which way you slice it up, there are three matches here where one team is heavily favored over the other team, and then this fourth match, which is Optic versus LAG, is one that realistically could go either way, and especially given LAG's performance at the last major, you can make that case that this is the hardest potential first round matchup for any of those teams in the quote unquote top four. Um, so I mean, even if Optic is able to hit like, the mega regain and come back in like that major three form, what kind of form is LAG going to show up in? Are they going to show up in their major four form, or are they going to show up um, like we've seen previously this year, where despite they played well on LAN all year, so it's tough to say that, but they obviously struggled online. So are we going to get online LAG on LAN? I guess that's a really bad analogy, but for lack of a better example, what LAG is going to show up here? Another case to be had for Optic is, despite this not necessarily being a quote unquote home event, the event is being held in Texas. And I think Optic is like the quote unquote host or whatever. I don't know like the official terminology behind that or anything, but um, talked about it last time when we're talking about Major Four and stuff, like Major Four happening with no crowd and whatnot. That's obviously something that I don't think played a major factor in Optic's top 12 placing at the major, just because of the way they've been playing. But the fan and the roar of the crowd and all that stuff can only really benefit Optic more than so many other teams, just because of their hugely dedicated fan base in the Green Wall. So is that going to be enough to like propel Optic and give them you know, the the edge they need in a first round matchup here? I don't know. Um, this is the one I think this just has. Looking at these first round matchups, I think the other three are pretty clear cut. Obviously, thinking about Major Four, we also thought Toronto versus LAG was pretty clear cut, and then LAG pulls off a major upset, right? So it's tough to say that, but right now, the way I'm looking at it is this is the match with Optic versus LAG that could just have massive implications on the entire rest of the bracket. Because if Optic comes out firing like they and shows the form they showed earlier in the year, that's got to be a scary thought for any of these other teams they got to be playing against. On the other hand, if LAG comes out, plays well, and sends Optic to the losers bracket, now those other teams that are down the losers bracket, they got to play against Optic in the losers bracket, and you'd much rather play against LAG than Optic in the losers bracket, just despite recent performances and whatnot. Like, just talent level on a team, you got to think like
Yeah.
it's a tougher draw. So I don't know. I mean, there's obviously probably some teams that would, if Optic comes out and gets 3-0 stomped by LAG, then they're going to be happy to face Optic in the losers bracket. But a lot of question marks around Optic, and this is definitely the match I have circled for the first day of champs. And like I said, I think this is going to just it's like that first domino just waiting to
Mm-hmm.
fall, and no matter, it's gonna fall. It doesn't matter what direction it goes in or what the result is, but whatever happens between these two teams, it's gonna have massive impact on the rest of the tournament, and I'm so excited for it.
Yeah, it's by far the most interesting matchup simply from that, the implications of it. If Optic wins, that breaks their losing streak. They win their first match in a month and a half. And then what kind of Optic do we get in the second round? Is this a team that's reinvigorated and they got their confidence back and they're ready to crush Toronto or crush LAT and fly through the winners bracket? Or is it a team that they get, even if they get the win, they're just still in disarray. They're still not able to figure out like a team like LAT or a team like Toronto, and they lose. Like that really is so interesting. Obviously, the flip side is if they lose that first round matchup, like that's a ridiculous scenario, like just logically from what we know Optic is capable of. But like you said, like it's really LAG has played much better recently, despite their ceiling level being much lower. Optic is capable of winning a championship. I don't believe LAG is capable of winning a championship with this current roster, but the way things have worked out recently, LAG has been way closer to winning a championship and way closer to their potential than Optic has. And which Optic and which LAG show up in this one series. It doesn't need to be a super long time. These series are only going to take an hour and a half. Whichever team is the best or shows up, more, I guess, in that hour and a half window, it's fascinating to think about.
And I don't necessarily. I'm trying to look up the stats real quick. I don't necessarily think of LAG as like this god S&D squad or anything like that. And I'm pretty sure even in their win, yeah. So even when they beat Toronto, they won 2 hard points, which is pretty surprising to me. So I'm what I'm about to say, about LAG. I still don't think of them as like this, like God squad for S&D or anything like that. But Optics S&D, I believe it's on like a 12-game losing streak now or something along those lines, is just been so bad that this also makes that a favorable aspect of the matchup for LAG. Like I said, I don't think of LAG's current roster and like, oh my god, I don't want to play them in S&D, but they have the chemistry. Most of that squad's been together now for this year for a good chunk of it, and they had Flames come in. Um, and they've had some moments. There've been like 1v4s, 1v3 clutches I can think of. I'm pretty sure Fame had a 1v4, if I remember correctly, the first and only 1v4 of the year so far. So it's like, it's not a team like, just for lack of a better example, like we've talked about Optic historically, and like even the Dynasty team where it was like, okay, like Search is the weak point. They're gonna go out, they're gonna win 3 respawns against you, and they're not gonna win the Search. Like it's not like Optic is playing a team like that where they know like, they don't have to worry about Search. This is a matchup where it's like, the search hasn't been great for Optic, and it might not be the greatest for LAG, but it's definitely, you got to favor LAG search over Optic search at this point, and that's a scary prospect, especially if looking at LAG's run at Major Four. They win 2 hard points there against Toronto. I would consider Toronto one of the better hardpoint teams on the season this year, especially going back to Major One when they were just looking like unstoppable. Where would and then they 3-0 to LAT, so it's kind of hard to get anything off that, and then they lost 3-0 to FaZe in New York. So it's tough to take anything away really from like a map count perspective from Major Four for them.
Yeah.
But the 2 hardpoint wins against Toronto definitely stand out to me. End of the day though, regardless, like Optics S&D has been in such a dire spot that it's like any team they play against, if they have any semblance of coordination and search, like they should, if they're, I mean, you could make the argument some of these teams might be like, we don't want to watch Optics VOD and search because
Mm-hmm.
we don't want to, like, they're probably going to just throw everything out the window and start from scratch. Obviously we saw the leaked screenshots and whatnot of accuracy potentially helping them in search and whatnot. um so like a team like LAG could be like, oh, we're gonna prep for Optics search, and they could watch some VOD on some map, and then Optics just coming out with completely different strats because they're like, whatever the hell we were doing before ain't working, so we gotta try new shit now.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It's a loaded conversation in terms of what this match could look like. Um, I'm really excited. Obviously, I'm excited for champs in general, but this one, like I said earlier, is definitely the matchup for the first round. I got circled, and no matter what happens, it feels like it's going to be a spicy one. If we get Optic winning the bounce back, the timeline's going to be on fire, And obviously, if Optic loses, goes down to the losers bracket, timeline's going to be on fire too. So it's going to be a good one.
So LAG in Major Four and the Major Four qualifiers were 6-7 in search. So obviously a little bit less than 50%. Of course, that's way better than Optic. They won one S&D in the Major Four qualifiers, and I believe they lost the rest of them. They lost both of the S&Ds against Miami at Major Four. So they are, you know, right now they're the worst S&D team. The way that they've been playing recently. But when you look in totality, this is according to Breaking Point. On LAN events this year, Optic and LAG are 50% win percentage in S&D. They are, they're tied with each other. They're tied for the seventh highest or whatever. Like they're very middle of the road in terms of search and destroy. At least in the success rate, of course, that's factoring in, Optic being a good team earlier in the year. They're not very good right now. LAG is also has a different roster than they did, but like I just laid it out with their Major Four online qualifiers and the Major Four LAN tournament stuff, they're about 50% in search from that as well. So I'm sure I would not be surprised if it goes to another game 5 that Optic has went to 6 game 5s out of 7. That's kind of what they've been doing recently. Personally, I think Optic's going to win. I can't pick against a team that is capable of winning a championship. But man, it's very, very likely that LAG comes out and really turns Optic's world upside down.
Especially given the fact that I think we're going to agree on these other 3 teams. I will go with LAG for the sake of the pick'em here, but I think I laid it out enough now in the last like 10, 15 minutes here. I think this one could go either way. And it really all this whole conversation started with you asking which Optic do I think is going to show up. I mean, that's the end of the day, that's going to be the determining factor in this just as much as which LAG is showing up. You know, I'm really excited for this match. I'll pick LAG for the pick'em, but definitely one I could see going either way. But it's not. I say that, but like if Optic plays the way they played recently, it's not. It's one I think LAG should win. But if Optic plays like they did at Major 3, it's one that LAG shouldn't win. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm excited.
And these teams haven't played much at all this season. They've only played twice, and both of them have been online. Optic won both matches 3-1. LAG won the opening hardpoint in their first matchup of the season, and then lost the rest. And then the second matchup, Optic wins the first 2, LAG wins the control, and then Optic wins it was a really tight series, that second one.
That was the one. That second series was like it was right after LAG added Flames, and they had the 2-0 week. And then I don't remember who they played that week after. It was Optic and somebody else, but I remember talking about it on the pod and being like these are tough matches,
Miami.
and it's gonna okay, so maybe not, but I remember talking about the Optic match here, being like, okay, this is gonna be the true test for this LAG. Was it a honeymoon phase, or is this new squad the real deal after a 2-0 week? And obviously, they didn't get the win, but I do remember those maps being closer than you probably would have thought or probably would have seen with the former roster. So, we also do know LAG struggles online, so it makes sense, if you say Optics 2-0 against them online this year. I don't know. It's going to be a good one either way. I really feel like it.
And then we have which of the other 3? I would say the most intriguing one to me is Toronto and LAT, because Toronto did not show up in their first round matchup in Major 4 against LAG, but then they made an incredible run through the losers bracket. LAT has shown flashes of being at times I thought, man, they're really good. Like they could do something here. They could win. They could beat one of these teams in the top 4. I'm just not sure if that's in the cards here for LAT. I think Toronto is a pretty tough matchup for them in particular. But what do you think of Toronto versus LAT?
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing is what you alluded to is in terms of Toronto not having a repeat of Major Four. They need to come out firing and come out hot. You know, probably scrappy, talking some trash and whatnot, get the boys fired up. Um, because if they drop down to the losers bracket, like that lower part of the bracket, we could be in another situation here where we have another battle of LA in winners bracket semis, and then one of those teams is guaranteed top three again, like at Major Four. That would be kind of funny. But yeah, this is when I'm fully expecting Toronto to win, barring some just miraculous, like probably like Ghosty 2.0 KD performance. I think Toronto should be able to take care of this one.
And I just looked at it. Toronto's 3-0 against
Yeah.
LAT this season. Again, all three were online, and all of them, I believe, were 3-1 in favor of Toronto. So, you know, again, you can kind of throw those results out the window, but I think they're kind of interesting just to take a look back at. But yeah, I think Toronto is going to win this. I mean, they're a championship contender, I believe. They have a real shot at winning champs this year, and of course, they got to the grand finals last year. They were very strong in the winners bracket, and it just kind of fell apart in the grand finals. But yeah, I believe the Ultra will win this. Um, then we have New York versus Seattle, which, of course, New York for most of the season was that fourth team that we were talking about. How they were pretty like they were certainly not in the same league as the top three, or not performing at that time in the same league as the top three. But then Major Four came around. They win Major Four. They prove that they are a championship contender, a very legitimate one, and that they are someone that probably they could be a favorite heading in. The last 2 years, the team that won the final major, they won champs as well. Of course, New York was that team last year. They finish off the regular season with a Major 5 championship victory. Then they go to champs and they win. Of course, they did lose in the winners bracket of that, and then they come through the losers bracket and completely demolished the Toronto Ultra in the grand finals. Again, they might have the best player in the league in Hydra. We talked about it last week when we were talking about MVP and All Star. He's a very legitimate MVP candidate. I think he of he's in the top three. I would say in terms of deservability. Like, he is one of the best players in the world, if not the best, and that should play a factor. But if New York is not going to show up, like, they did not show up for quite a bit of this season. That first major, they laid a complete egg. And while they were a lot better as we continued to move forward through the season, they were still quite inconsistent. Seattle, on the other hand, has just not been that kind of team. They haven't shown that they're at that level, so I think that plays a big factor. But where do you stand on this New York versus Seattle matchup, and obviously Sib playing his former team at Champs?
And there's that little mini rivalry we saw earlier this year brewing between Sib and O4. So this is a should be an interesting first round matchup, all things considered. But yeah, this is one you expect New York to come out and take care of business, especially if they play like they did at Major Four. We have seen this year, though, kind of like you said, the roller coaster for New York, like the ups and downs. We have seen them previously earlier this year not get off to the strongest of starts at tournaments. So it's a question in terms of what we're going to get from them to start this one. But if they play anything like they did, especially after getting sent down to the losers bracket. I mean, heck, they lost in the first round of Major Four, right? And then they're able to go on the losers bracket run to win the title there. So it's technically not even the end of the world if they lose this first round matchup here to Seattle. But all things considered, you expect them to, keep on, you know, having that fire and for a majority of this team, the possibility of repeating, going back to back at champs is a historic feat that they're chasing after. So, definitely expecting New York to come out firing in this series and take care of business against Seattle, but like I just said, it hasn't been It's completely smooth sailing for them this year, so it could be a small hiccup to start things off, and we'll just have to wait and see. But yeah, I think New York should handle business here.
I believe New York will handle business. This is, I think, obviously I shouldn't say this because it's gonna probably jinx the subliners, but I think this is the most confident pick that I have, at least for this first round. Even further past than Atlanta. Just simply, I
Interesting.
just don't think Seattle is really a good matchup, or New York is a bad matchup for Seattle. And then we're left with Atlanta versus Miami, the number 1 and 8 seed. Atlanta, of course, they are what they are. They are one of the best teams in the league. They seem to be very capable of winning a championship. But we have talked about in the recent past about how this team that they might get to championship Sunday, but they don't always come out ahead. They have, I think, a losing record on championship Sunday or in these grand finals or whatever. So that is a discussion point. But as for the first round of a tournament, I believe Atlanta will win. The Heretics are, very, very much they deserve congratulations, right? Because they even made it to champs. The first year of the Heretics, they completely changed this roster. The only holdover is Vickle. They go to an all Spanish team. They even make a few roster changes in the middle of the season. So they deserve a ton of credit for even getting to this point. But beating Atlanta FaZe is a very, very tough ask. And I just don't think that they have the firepower to match a team that has two actual MVP candidates, and all four players could be all stars very easily.
Yeah, I think I just reminded myself when we were talking there of Major Three. Atlanta played Miami first match in the first round of winners bracket there, and Atlanta wins 3-0 or 3-1, sorry, over Miami, with Miami winning the search. Obviously, both teams are kind of in different spots. This was when Atlanta, at least in my head, they were kind of struggling a little bit in search. If struggling is the word you want to use, they just weren't as dominant as they had looked like earlier in the season, and then some of those online matches leading up to that, and then in this event throughout it, they kind of like had some struggles in search. Whereas Miami was playing pretty well. I think it was on 6 star and high rise. They won this one on 6 star search against Atlanta. I think high rise was the other one because I remember like an Octane tweet about Miami search on 6 star and high rise. But um, regardless, this was also a Miami team that was like more fresh with that Real pickup. So like now Miami has some more reps with Real, and he's only gotten better as the season's gone on, and he's gotten more time with this Miami team. So it's definitely an interesting one. This is one I could probably see going 3-1 again for Atlanta. But the question will be what's that one? Because I feel like Atlanta's a better search team now um, than potentially the last time they played in that matchup that we're highlighting. Maybe Miami's able to take a hard point or something. I'm not really sure, but it could be a bit of a closer match than last time. Still definitely expecting Atlanta to take this one. I mean I think Atlanta's the best team still, and I think they are. Um, in a position to start the tournament off strong, but they have to come out and actually, get the job done in a matchup. They like I said, they have experience playing this team in the first round. Um, Circumstances and the way the teams are gelling at this time and chemistry and all that stuff, like more behind the scenes stuff, I guess it could be changing or evolving for both of these teams as the season has progressed since that last matchup there. I don't even know if that's actually the last time they played, but um yeah, I think Atlanta should be the heavy favorites in this one, regardless of that. It will be interesting, though, to see, especially in that search. Like, if Atlanta comes out and dominates the search, that should be a really good sign of things to come for Atlanta potentially throughout the rest of this tournament. But if Atlanta struggles in the search against Miami, especially if it's one of those two maps I mentioned, they like let that through in the veto process and they play Miami on one of their better search maps. Miami's able to take it. Like, what does that say about Atlanta's search for the rest of the tournament? So something to keep an eye on there. But definitely, yeah, going with Atlanta here.
Yeah, so that's interesting that you brought up, like which map or which game mode that they could win, Miami being. And so the first time that they played was in the Major 2 qualifiers. Miami wins the opening hard point, sub-base hard point, and then lose the next 3 maps. In the Major 3 tournament, obviously Miami, they win 6-star S&D and they lose the respawns, so they lose 3-1 again. And then the last time they played was in these Major 4 qualifiers, and Miami won the control. They won high-rise control, and they lost very close hard point, Vista hard point 250 to 247 in that opening map. And it should be noted that FaZe actually won high rise search 6-5 in that very first matchup. So I'm not really sure. Like I don't really. You can make something out of it, and that it does show that Miami's capable of beating FaZe. Granted, the first time it wasn't even with Real, and it was with Eric Boom. So how much you actually can play into that, who knows? But it has shown that Miami can win these maps, but they haven't been able to string any more than one map together. And Atlanta's 9-3 against them this season. Only played that one time, Major 3 on LAN. So I'll go with FaZe. I think they're the obvious favorite in this matchup. But I do think Miami is an odd pairing for them. Miami is a lot better than they were earlier in the season. They did not really show up on LAN as we have talked about in the past, but they've seemed to fix a lot of those issues, and they are, they deserve to be here, and I'm very happy for them. I'm interested to see what happens when it comes down to Atlanta versus Miami on Thursday. And then from there, who knows what happens, right? We might be wrong on every single one of those, but whichever 4 teams lose, they will be slotted down into the losers bracket, and they'll have to fight their way through the losers bracket to get to the grand finals. Again, this is an 18 tournament, so if you win 3 matches in the winners bracket, then you will be awarded a spot in the grand finals. Of course, I'm sure some people will complain about that, but at the end of the day, that's how it is. And it's not going to be easy for sure. I don't think for any team to get to the grand finals, because if you're FaZe, you're going to have to play Miami and probably New York. And then who knows, Toronto, LAT, Optic, LAG, who knows? Like LAG was in the winners finals last time. It'll be interesting. Who do you think, let's talk first of the bottom 4. So we're including Optic in the top 4 right now, but if there was a dark horse between LAG, LAT, Seattle, and Miami, which of those 4 teams do you think is most likely, not likely, but most likely to win champs this weekend?
I think the one that's in the best position to make a run is LAG. I think that's probably a little bit of a cop-out answer just because it's basing it on LAG's performance at Major 4. If you want to get a little spicy, maybe I could say Seattle just to play devil's advocate. I think Seattle has really, since bringing in 04 and Abuza switching to like that main AR, I feel like they've just been only getting better as a team, really. Hook has really, like, from a lot of the listening and stuff, his comms have been a little hectic, and it seems like just filled with a bit more emotion than probably some longtime Hook fans are used to hearing from him. And we've seen Hook do it on the biggest stage before and win champs before, so he's got that veteran edge, and he's able to tell these other guys like what can happen if you're able to push through and make a run at champs, and how awesome that must feel at the end of the day. So I think the most logical answer of those 4 is LAG based on the run they made at Major 4. If I had to give a non-LAG answer, though, I think I'd go Seattle.
Yeah, so I agree with you on the LAG front. At least their first round matchup is such a coin toss that kind of plays to their favor. And then even the fact that Toronto came out slow last time, lost their first round matchup, they might play LAT, who they've had tremendous success against, which then gets them into the winners finals. And then who knows where you go from there. But I definitely agree with you on LAG. I would also say LAT. simply because Toronto also, like I just mentioned, came out really slow in the first round of Major Four. They got knocked down to the losers bracket. LAT, if there is a second round matchup, even with the lack of success that they've had against the Gorillas, I think LAT would take that matchup rather than Optic. So I think LAT has that in them. The only problem is that LAT has been really bad on land in search and destroy, which has been like a really big point of focus, and definitely something that they've been one of the best teams in search online. They've won 66% of S&Ds online, which is third in the league, only behind Atlanta and New York. But then when they go on LAN, they're winning less than 40% of their searches. Of course, obviously the competition is much greater when you get onto LAN, but they're at 36.4% S&D win percentage on LAN. Um, I don't know if that's something that they could, if that's it's obviously not a fluke because it's an entire season, but I don't know if that's something that they could kind of average out, and if they're able to win half of their search and destroy maps, maybe they can make a little bit of a run. But of course, it's a dark horse. It's not likely. I would say is the most kind way I can put it. But the top four, they're a top four for a reason. Each of these teams has shown us this season that they're capable of winning a championship. Of course, Optic is a wild card. They're a question mark heading into this event, but they can't be discounted and they can't be cast aside. They have a very good chance of winning champs this year. Um, I would not pick them. I don't think anyone in their right mind should pick them to win the championship based on what we've seen and how good the other top three teams have been, even recently. But Optic has to be in that conversation. If I had to pick one to win the championship, I've been really bad at picking winners this year, like really, really bad. I don't think I've even got one right because I don't think I picked. I definitely didn't pick Toronto first time around. I
Yeah.
might have picked New York, to be honest, because they had such a strong qualifiers, and then I definitely didn't pick FaZe when they won because I would have remembered. Um, I, I don't know, like I I would say the subliners because they've shown that they just won,
Yeah.
and we have evidence from last season with this team or three quarters of this team that played a factor. But I don't know I mean, I'm assuming that you're going with FaZe. I mean, you're.
Yeah, you know me well enough by now.
I mean, it's hard to pick against them, even if they've had their troubles on Championship Sunday or in these big moments. Like
Yeah.
they almost always get to these big moments, which isn't always is. It's not a guarantee with New York, as we saw with Major One. It's not a guarantee with Toronto. So I can't blame you for picking FaZe.
No, yeah. So that's I'm thinking Atlanta right now. I think that's the most like the way of looking at it, and we had this conversation last time with like people freaking out about their record or lack of success or however you want to phrase it. They're just their record in championship Sunday and finals. Um, but they still have like that strength to even just get to that position, and that's like if you're picking a team, it's you go back to like March Madness, like are you going to pick a 16 seed to win it all, or you going with another a lower ranked team just because they have a better strength of schedule and better overall record, and you expect them to make it to actually have a shot at the end of the day. And I think that's what like Atlanta has that best shot to just be there competing for the championship. That the fact of whether they will get the job done and whatnot can be a different part of the conversation. Um, but I do have to say I think looking at the way this bracket is, and again eyeing that Optic LAG matchup, if Toronto takes care of business against LAT, regardless of who they play between Optic or LAG, I feel like Toronto has a much easier route to the winners bracket finals. It's kind of weird to say that because LAG did beat Toronto at Major 4. Optic obviously beat Toronto at Major 3. but I feel like Toronto is still the better team, better than both of those teams, and I like Toronto's odds against LAG or Optic more than say like an Atlanta versus New York matchup in that top half of the bracket. That's a much like we obviously saw New York win it in the Major Four finals, and you expect Atlanta to be competitive in a series like that. That's one that's much harder to predict in my eyes than Toronto versus one of those other teams. Um, so Toronto could just be like this team that has a sneaky. I don't want to say sneaky. It's weird because it's an 18 tournament, but I feel like Toronto just has an easier potential path to winners bracket finals than New York or Atlanta. If New York and Atlanta have to square off, because that's a matchup between those two. Even though, like I said, we just saw it, I feel like it could go either way.
Yeah, and I was just looking up like what is the transitive property between these teams, because we've seen kind of each beat another, and like New York at least recently has that advantage. So they lost to Atlanta FaZe, if people remember, at the first
Yep.
match of Major 4. They lose in the first round 3-0, and then they come back and they meet Atlanta FaZe again in the grand finals and they win 4-2. So like at Major 4, obviously New York gets the last laugh, but if you're looking at map count, FaZe won 5 maps, New York won 4. So like it's obviously pretty even. Like it's a relatively fair matchup. New York also beat Toronto at Major 4. They 3-0'd them. The last time that New York played Optic was in the Major 4 qualifiers. It was a Game 5 victory for New York, but they lost to Optic in Game 5 of Major 3. If you look at Atlanta, they haven't had a ton of success against some of these teams. Of course, they did beat New York, like I just mentioned, in Major 4, but then lost in the grand finals. Against Toronto, their last matchup was in the Major 4 qualifiers, Game 5 loss to Toronto. They had beaten New York in Game 5 in the first Major 4 qualifier match. And then at Major 3, they played all 3 of the top 4, or the rest of the top 4. They played New York in the second round. They beat them 3-0. Then they lost in Game 5 to Toronto, and then they lost in Game 5 to Optic. I just don't know, like, because I think Optic is just like, it's a variable. Obviously, what they do is completely unknown, and that's gonna completely change how we view this tournament. But FaZe, they've they've been so close, and I think that can't be discounted, right? They're almost always on in Championship Sunday. They're almost always in the top 4. Like I think if you look at all the majors and champs, they've probably finished outside the top 4 like once or twice in CDL history. But in my opinion, it's probably New York, because they have that recent success, and I weigh recent success, especially at the end of the season when there hasn't been much changes in terms of the meta and what teams are expecting now, and when the teams are shrunk, or the team size or the team pool is shrunk, I tend to lean toward that recent success. So I'm gonna go with New York to win the championship. You're going with FaZe. We're probably both wrong. It's going to be Toronto or Optic, and that's just how it is. But I'm very, very interested to just see how things work out either way, because these are. I'm just so happy that it ended up like this, where we have those top 4 teams in different first round matchups. So we don't have to pit them against each other immediately. We can kind of see how that plays out. You know, the best case scenario, at least from like an how intriguing it is to me, is if each win the first round, and then we get those mega matchups of Atlanta versus New York in one semifinal, Toronto versus Optic in another semifinal, and then we even get some really intriguing loser bracket matches as well. But I mean, who knows what happens? We were trying to predict so many different things last time, and then Toronto lays an egg against LAG, and everything is thrown out of whack. And that very well may happen again at Champs.
So just give me one. So it looks like I pulled up the bracket from champs last year, and it looks like just in the first round it drops straight down.
Okay,
Um,
so it'd be
so that would
Miami versus
mean
Seattle and LAT
Miami,
versus
Seattle,
LAG, if
LAT versus whichever of
yeah,
those. Yeah.
if the lower bracket. or lower seeded teams won.
Those are interesting. Yeah, I mean, either way, I mean, that's if Toronto beats LAT, we get an HBR Classic or a Battle of LA, no
Yeah.
matter who wins in the loser bracket. So that's good. Um, Seattle versus Miami is probably one I lean towards Seattle in, but and then maybe going back to our dark horse convo, like that's one if Seattle was able to take care of business against Miami, could be one to get the boys on fire and get them rolling a little bit, maybe start a losers bracket run, but will be interesting to see for sure. I'm just super excited for Champs in general.
Yeah, and Seattle versus Miami is kind of a matchup of teams that were kind of fighting for that fifth, sixth spot for
Yeah,
a lot of the season. And I think that's an underrated part. Obviously, only one team can win champs, right? But I I want to see which team outside of that top four is able to kind of be above the rest. Like which, and obviously there's going to be a fifth, sixth spot, but I just want to see if it ends up how Seattle versus LAT or Seattle versus in Miami, like those three teams. LAG was not really part of that conversation for a while, but those three teams were really kind of vying for that fifth spot for a big part of the season, and we're gonna see what happens at champs. Who do you think wins MVP? So if you think Atlanta FaZe wins, obviously that's a really difficult conversation about who is supposed to win champs MVP, because they have four very capable players. But if you had to pick which of the four,
I'm gonna go. I'm gonna just. I think if FaZe gets the job done, I'm gonna go with Celium for Champs MVP. We've had this conversation before. Simp potential regular season MVP candidate, as is Celium. But I picked Celium to be the Champs MVP and regular season MVP in the past before. I feel like if FaZe is going to get over that hump that some people think there is for them on Champ Sunday or whatnot, and Celium has like a superstar performance in the grand finals if they get there, I could feel him getting MVP. I think if New York gets the job done, it's got to be Hydra for MVP. Maybe if 99 Kids just has another pop off performance, he could be shown some love. Um, but I would feel like I would lean Hydra for New York. For Toronto, I feel like it's got to be Scrappy if they're going to pull it off. Could be, of a similar vein to the 99 Kids shout out. If Envoy just has a really strong performance in the grand finals, could be a case of him like potentially having his best statistical season or stat line of the season when it matters most and getting a shout out for MVP. So I could see that there. I'm not going to go through the other teams because I'm even like for a team like Optic, I feel like you could make a case for any of those guys, and based on the way they've been playing, it's kind of tough to say. But for those top three teams, if they're the ones lifting the trophy, you can definitely make the case for multiple players. It kind of goes back to our conversation last week on All Stars, MVPs, all that good stuff. So I guess we can shout that out real quick if you guys missed last week's episode and have any thoughts on who should be All Stars, MVP, Rookie of the Year, all that good stuff for the 2024 CDL season. Check out last week's episode.
yeah, and event MVPs are really difficult to predict because like we saw last year, Kismet won champs MVP, but Hydra was the season MVP. It doesn't always work out, and even this season, I think Kleenex won the Major One MVP, and Scrappy has been the MVP candidate for the Toronto Ultra all season long. So it's really unpredictable. I would agree with you on those kinds of picks. And really it's kind of a narrative as well, like how if you perform above expectations or if you have like memorable moments, then I think that really plays a big factor in who wins champs MVP. But man, I'm really excited. I'm glad that it's almost here. Like we've spent so much time, most of our time talking about online matches, a little bit about major matches, but champs is a completely different beast. We met for the first time 2018, right? World War II champs. Obviously, we saw Patty P cement his legacy, and win with Evil Geniuses. We also saw Optic have the worst champs performance I've ever seen of Optic that
We
year.
didn't even get to see Optic
Yeah,
play.
they were immediately eliminated. Then
Because the way it happened, they didn't have like the venue open because
yeah,
it was the 32 team champs, so they were playing like pool play in the Columbus
yeah,
MLG studio or whatever. Because I remember I got there, Had an Airbnb with Jim, Mike, and Nick. Shout out the boys. And I was on the couch in the Airbnb when Optic lost to EG to get eliminated, and I had to write the article of Optic getting eliminated from champs like before it even really started from the Airbnb. So that was just a wild event to even get things started there.
Um, we could see something similar happen. I mean, that Optic roster it lives in infamy. The Methods Octane version of the team. But if Optic if they lose to LAG, they get knocked out, a double first rounded at champs. This Pred Kenny lineup will be seen as a gigantic failure. And
But we can have this discussion in the off season based on how they play. But I mean, they won a tournament.
yeah,
Like
and
Octane and Methods. They had the best record in whatever, like the stage qualifiers. They played really well.
they
Like
major
in
two.
the well, I'm talking about.
You're talking about the Octane one.
Yeah, in World War
Yeah,
II, it was like whatever, like the stage matches or whatever they were called. Like back then,
yeah.
they played really well in those, and then they didn't get an actual championship, and obviously they got top 24 at champs. So it's tough to compare, but the Kenny and Pred roster does have a championship, so it's tough to say that roster is worse than the EG or the 2018 end of 2018 Optic roster.
I would never say that they were worse than that team because they, so it was stage two. They finished top of their division. They
Yeah,
were 10-4.
yeah.
The teams that were in that: United, Unilad, Rise Nation, Luminosity, Complexity, Mind Freak, and Tainted Minds. Tainted Minds, shout out Tainted Minds, 1-13, 13-41 map count. But I would never say Optic, this current team, is the worst, even if they get double first rounded. But I think this has got to be the most disappointing, simply because they got the fans so hyped up and excited after winning Major 3, and if they were to get double first rounded, of course, to lose like whatever 9 straight matches to end the season and get knocked out by LAG, who has not had a super. I mean, lately they've had a good season, but they're also a team on the bubble of even making champs, and then they would lose to whatever LAG or to LAT, which is a team that hasn't performed well on land. So, but yeah, it's a conversation, especially if it actually happens. We will be having this conversation about this time next week, whether we should shame these Optic players or not. I'm just very excited. Like I said, this is the best event of the year because every team has kind of been building toward this. All of the roster changes, all of the online matches, the experiments that a team like FaZe and Toronto may run in these online matches when they're playing against the Boston Breach. All that goes out the window now. It's about who's the best over a 4-day period, and who can really change their entire legacy or how people even remember them in their careers. We saw last year we had first-time winners, and that completely changes how people view Hydra now
First EU
versus
winner.
yeah.
Unless you
And
count Tommy on the Empire bench.
shout out Tommy, but I don't think we should count him on that. But this year we have the capability of seeing if Atlanta FaZe wins, for example. We have Simp and Abizi becoming 3-time world champions, Draws and Cell winning their second. So those all 4 players become even bigger in those all-time conversations. Obviously, if Optic wins, the comeback of winning a championship after having a horrible end to the year. And then you're looking at Kenny winning another championship, Shotzi winning another championship, Dashy, who's been maligned for the last year or two for Optic, he wins his championship. Pred, who has been maligned for the last month and a half, he gets to win his championship. Toronto, obviously, big, it'd be a huge win for them. That organization's had so many close calls. I think they've been to two champs grand finals and they have not one. And obviously, third time's the charm, I guess, or it could be. And if New York wins again, then back to back. That's the first time that an organization or like the actual like team brand has won back to back championships, and probably the first time in a while that three players. I don't know if that's ever happened. Three players together win back to back champs. There have been back to back championships in COD history, but not. I don't think in like even that much. I think it's probably been only like one player or two players. So again, another I guess storyline to watch. And if any of Miami, Seattle, LAT, LAG, if they win, then like we're having a completely different conversation. Like that's one of the most shocking things to ever happen in Champs history. So if we'll talk about that if it actually happens, but I hope everybody enjoys Champs. If you're going out there, please be safe, be responsible, wash your hands because the post event cod flu has been pretty much infamous in the community. So please make sure to stay healthy and have fun. But yeah, we'll be back next week. We will add up all the pick'ems. We'll see who wins. I'm just 4 matches behind you. You're 162 and 78. I'm 158 and 82. I have a feeling that Trimmer will not be catching up to either one of us at 0 and 1. But never say never. And but we'll be back next week, sometime Sunday at the very earliest, obviously, or maybe earlier, Monday or Tuesday next week. But we'll be back to talk about whatever happens at Champs. We'll break it all down, and we'll kind of put a bow on this season that has been the 2024 CDL season. Make sure to subscribe, like, and follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. Maybe leave a review if you really like it. If you don't, please don't leave a review. I don't need that negativity in my life. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers, and the podcast Twitter's at Ego Chall Podcast. And we'll see you sometime next week. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys as always for the support. You kind of briefly mentioned it at the end there when you were talking about teams like not being able to say like they're trying out maps and whatnot. One thing we didn't get to talk about that I just thought about when you were saying that is all those like quote unquote nerd spots and stuff you hear about, like people saying like they find spots earlier in the year and they save them for champs. Like this is where you're not holding anything back. This is the last event and we're gonna see everything. So I'm really excited for champs in general. A lot of cool storylines, like you were going through the list of potential winners and what it means for their legacy and stuff like that. Like we're gonna have so much to talk about next week, and hope you guys do enjoy watching champs, and hope you guys enjoyed this preview. And if you do, hope to see you guys back here in some form after champs is all done and we're breaking it down for you and getting into 2025 roster mania. It's coming quick. So thank you guys as always, and remember to send the chow.